Okay, so given that Christian keeps spreading this rumour that I talk so much, I thought it would be a good idea to start the session early, and in that way I could keep talking and it may not be so embarrassing or difficult for the speaker. We're going to finish the session around about 4, and then there's going to be the general meeting of the society, of which everybody is a member, and Christian will then tell you about our plans for the future. The plans for the future are, putting it broadly, that this will become 3 times bigger, 3 times better, more focused on Asia, a wider range of keynote speakers and so on. Now, you may have noticed the young ladies and the young men with yellow shirts who've done a great job. We assemble them and we train them. I had a little session with a group of them to prepare them for the conference. And I asked them, ask me any question. And one of them, really nice young lady, said, how do I get great original ideas like Eddie? She didn't say Eddie, I said Eddie. Like everybody must know that when you get old you retire. So what's the point? I mean, and everybody knows the old guys don't earn their money, so what's the point? And so I tried to explain Eddie's first big famous paper. And then I said to them, well, don't worry too much, because very few people, like hardly any, write famous papers and become known for them. And so while it's nice that you should think about becoming famous like that, don't really do it. Work hard. And then some of these people are rather shy. Then when somebody said, well, I want to do more than that. I said, oh, yes. She said, I want to establish a field. I said, well, what do you mean like a field? And she said, like econometrics or price theory. I said, look, a lot of these are undergraduates. I said, look, forget about that. Nobody establishes a field, right? Just forget about it. And then one of these, so I'm going to be a bit rude here. One of these kids suddenly said, but what about Professor, what about Eddie? I said, well, it's true that he's established a field, but while, only a handful have ideas, only one person establishes a field. Okay, so I'm about to move away and somebody said, I'm not interested in that. I want to advise people and be important. I want to talk to kings and queens, presidents even. And I said, well, look, that's good. I mean, you can do that. I mean, Martin Parkinson has done it, but that's a completely different group of people, completely different skills. And then I'm looking around, and one of these girls is sort of winking at the other one, and the other one sort of says to me, but what about Eddie? I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, he was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Oh, forget about it. You can't have ideas, establish fields, and be on the Council of Economic Advisors. And one kid said to me, the other one, these 2 girls are obviously working me over, right? One of them said to me, look, I'm not smart enough to have ideas. I'm very smart enough to know that you don't establish fields. And there's no way that the Premier of China is going to listen to me. But I can create an institution. I reckon I know how to do things. And they're a different sort of person, aren't they? And I said, that's right. That's very, very sensible. They're different sort of peoples. And the other kid sort of says, what about Eddie? I said, oh, no. What do you mean, Eddie? And she said, well, Eddie sort of, well, she didn't say sort of, Eddie created Soleil. And I said, well, she said, but aren't you establishing a society to extend throughout Asia? And I said, yeah. I'm so glad now they're starting to talk about me, leave Christian out of this. And she said, but isn't that related to IALI? Because that's where Christian. I said, yes. Alison Booth, she was president of IALI. I say, yes. And didn't all that start with Eddie? Well, I'm getting a bit annoyed, right? I said, well, that's true. Eddie started Soleil. Soleil got involved with IALI. I don't know who this Eddie guy is, but nobody really fits into this set of being as important as this. Anyway, I was a bit, I'm a reasonable guy, but these girls, and they got one more slip up there, one more sort of thing up their sleeve. And one of them sort of says to me, I don't want to do any of those things. I just want to be famous and talk to film stars. And I'm saying to myself, famous and talk to film stars? I don't get this, right? And I said, look, you can have ideas if you want to. You can establish fields if you want to. You can establish journals, the Journal of Labour Economics. You can advise presidents. You can create institutions. But if you want to talk to film stars, forget about it. And they say, and you know what they said? All of a sudden, Eddie's name dropped out. They said, what about Arnie? And I said, Arnie? I'm thinking to myself, Arnie Harburger? What's she talking about? She said, Arnie Schwarzenegger. And I'm completely confused. And she said, Arnie talked to Eddie. And then at that point, I gave up, right? Because Eddie was on the Council of Advisors for Arnold Schwarzenegger. Now, the whole point of this story is there cannot be an Eddie, right? I mean, I don't know who this Eddie character is, but nobody can fill all these slots. And so I don't know where these kids got the idea from, and the idea that they should aspire to either a centre which either has no people in it or only one, I felt really nice about that, right? Because one of the good things about teaching young people is you want them to have enormous aspirations. And it's important that somebody's achieved those enormous aspirations. And we're really lucky to have Eddie here for this purpose. Thank you, Eddie.
Well, thanks very much. I certainly need to have Bob as my press agent at every event. That was terrific. Let me say one thing about the Society before we get started. This is really just an amazing meeting, and I can say that from experience because I did start Solly, and that was a struggle. You know, it's obviously a very successful group of economists now, but when we first got started, you know, we had, I don't know, at the first meeting maybe 75 people, something like that, and you know, it took a while to get the ball rolling, and you know, I'm looking around, and this meeting, I don't know, what did you have, 300-400 people, 500? Yeah. So it's really, I think, hats off to the organizers, and you know, I'm not surprised because this is a very entrepreneurial group of people who started this society and organized it, and that's great because that leads me to my topic, which is entrepreneurship. So. So I'll move on to the substantive part of the talk, but I did want to congratulate the founders of the society. It really is an amazingly successful feat. Okay, so the title of the talk is The Personnel Economics View of Entrepreneurship, and the reason that I call it a personnel economics approach is that I want to focus on the labor market side of entrepreneurship. People who think about entrepreneurship obviously think about business formation. But what I want to do is I want to focus on skill formation. I want to focus on the choice to become an entrepreneur and some of the incentives associated with that. Now, I'm going to take as a given that entrepreneurship is something that most people view as important. I'm not going to present any data on that, but if you look at the correlation between entrepreneurship rates, business formation, and economic growth, you'll see that it's strongly positive. Now, of course, that's not proof that it's causal. That doesn't mean that if you figure out a way to get people to start a bunch of new businesses, you're going to have the economy grow. But it certainly is a strong correlation, and it does look like there are some causal elements to it. So I'm just going to take that as a given and assume that you'll humor me and allow me to motivate the talk by saying we all believe this is an important thing, and certainly business schools believe it, governments believe it, and I think even economists in academia believe it. So what I want to do today is I want to take you through basically three analyses. One that I did a long time ago, about 10 years, more than that, 15 years ago, and that was my first foray into the issue of entrepreneurship, and it was essentially looking at what kinds of individuals become entrepreneurs. And then what I want to do is talk about, so that was an old paper. There are two based on that, one in the AER, and one in the Journal of Labor Economics. And then I want to talk about a newer paper that's forthcoming in the Journal of Political Economy that actually thinks about this in a more aggregate way, in a more macro way, and is actually quite relevant to Asia, and you'll see why, because I'm going to talk a little bit about Japan as a motivating case, and also about China and some of the issues that may befall China if they don't sort of think about some of these things more carefully. And one of my co-authors has, and as I said, I'll point that out to you. And then finally, I want to end with another paper that's really in progress, and it's not clear that this will ever see the light of day. I'm not sure that we're going to be successful at it. But I want to give you a little bit of a hint as to where we're going on that. And I think, again, you'll get a sense for why that's important in labor economics. So, all right, so let me get started. Well, the first paper that I want to talk about is something that's come to be known the jack of all trades model of entrepreneurship. Now, Bob was kind enough to talk about ideas that I've come up with over my life, and most of them come from actually real-world experience. I'm not a guy who sits in an office with a yellow pad of paper and thinks of equations. It kind of, I look at the real world, and then the equations come later. That's because equations are hard for me. But looking at the real world is relatively easy. I watched a lot of TV as a kid. So when I was a professor at Stanford, we have an excellent MBA class. I always boast about the Stanford MBAs, and they really are an incredibly talented group of people. But what I noticed among them is that, although they're all very good, these are all really smart kids, it wasn't always the case that the smartest kid in the class would become the most successful. So, for example, I can name some very successful people from Stanford. I don't know whether they were good students when they were there, but Charles Schwab is one of them. I think most people have heard of Charles Schwab, the brokerage house. Phil Knight, who started Nike, is another one. Those are both Stanford graduates, enormously successful people. And they are not necessarily the people that I would have picked as the star academic kids in the class when they were students at Stanford. But what they were good at was lots of different stuff, okay, many, many things. And so what I argued, and again, this was based primarily on observation, was that in order to be successful in business, you can't just have one skill. You have to be a generalist. You essentially have to be a jack of all trades. And to put this in just kind of concrete terms for you, suppose that you want to start a restaurant. So like a lot of people who start their first businesses do so as immigrants when they come to the United States, or they come to Australia and they start a restaurant that reflects the culture from which they came. And so, think about starting a restaurant. Well, one thing you need in order to start a restaurant is you have to be a good cook, because if the food's lousy, no one's going to come to the restaurant. The other thing that you need to start a good restaurant is you actually have to have some business skills, because if you're a great cook but you have no business sense, the restaurant is going to fail. So if you think of those two things, they're not necessarily very highly correlated, but they're both essential to having a successful business. And so the people who succeed in starting a good restaurant are those people who are good cooks and also have a bit of business sense at the same time. And so that's the model that I want to write down, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to test that model, and I'm only going to spend a few minutes on this, and then I'm going to move on to the newer stuff, because many of you have probably seen this. So the way I modeled this is in the simplest possible way, and that's what you see in this particular equation. And what I said was, well, this is just a question of occupational choice. A couple slides ago, I said that, personnel economics is one of the things that's in personnel economics is occupational choice. And that's essentially what's going on here. You're going to choose to either be an entrepreneur or you're going to choose to work for someone else. And that's a decision about occupation. Now, if you choose to be an entrepreneur, what I argue is that you need to have both skills or multiple skills, and in this case I'm going to label those skills X1 and X2, and the business is going to be no stronger than its weakest link. So again, if you're not a very good cook, but you're a great business person, well, you'll have a restaurant that's not very successful, and it will be limited by the quality of the food. So what you see on the left-hand side is the output for a given individual who has characteristics X1 and X2, and it's the min of those two. So it's the weakest link, and it's multiplied by this term lambda. And what lambda is it's the market premium for having both skills at the same time. And that's market determined, and I'm not going to walk you through that right now, but that's derived in equilibrium in the paper. Let's just take that as a given. And that obviously has to be greater than 1. And the reason it has to be greater than 1 is because if you choose to become a specialist and to work for someone else, you don't need both skills. What you do is you simply take the max, you take your best thing, and that's what you concentrate on. And so what we have here is that you only become an entrepreneur if lambda times the min is greater than the max. And of course, since the min can never be greater than the max, lambda has to be bigger than 1. All right. So if you just work that out and write that down and kind of figure that out for all the cases, essentially what you're going to do is trace out this cone here. And people whose skills lie somewhere within that cone are going to be the entrepreneurs, and those outside that cone are going to be working for other people. And so that doesn't mean that people who are outside that cone are not successful. They could be very successful. So, for example, you may have a computer programmer who's completely technical, can barely speak English, but is superb at programming. And so she has very high levels of X1, but almost no X2. But as a result of that, she gets a high wage, and what does she do? She simply specializes in being a computer programmer. Or, at the other extreme, you can have someone who's got great verbal skills, no quantitative skills. What does he do? He becomes an advertising executive and writes ads, and he's up at the other end, all right? But then there are some people that have a combination of those skills, and they become entrepreneurs. Now, they may be low-ability entrepreneurs, so that their combination of X1 and X2 might be close to the origin, or they may be high-ability entrepreneurs like some of the people in my neighborhood. Mark Zuckerberg is one example, who's is a generalist, as it turns out. I met him a few weeks ago, and he's a very talented and actually charming guy, despite the movie that you may have seen about him. But he's obviously extremely able and is a generalist in that he has many, many different skills, okay? The guy who starts a hot dog stand is a generalist, but his level of ability is lower than that of Mark Zuckerberg's. So, okay, well, that's the model. And the model, of course, is a story, and anybody can tell a story and write down a model that captures that story, and that's what I just did, but that doesn't mean it's true. So in order to find out if it's true, what we have to do is we have to test it with some data. So the data that I used to test this analysis was data from Stanford. Fortunately, it turns out that Stanford keeps very good track of their MBA alums, and the reason that they do that is for the same reason that all business schools keep track of their alums, and that is that they want money from them. So what they do this in subtle ways, and the way they do it is they say, well, why don't you write down your job history for us so that we can kind of figure out whether you're a good target or not. And they don't say it that way, of course, but the job history gives you a pretty good sense of whether they are going to be a good target. Now, for my purposes, the job history was exactly what I needed, because what that does is it retrospectively creates a panel data set on these individuals where I have a person who has multiple job events in their life, and I can just trace those job events and ask whether those job events are jobs where you're working for someone else, or whether those are jobs where you're founding your own company, okay? And that's in the data set. Additionally, one of the nice things that they did is they asked you, not only did you were you a founder, but they also asked, what did you do at this company? They asked what roles that you had, and they gave you up to 5 different roles that you could list in this particular data set. So I could count the number of different roles that an individual played, and so the basic idea that I used to test this analysis is I said, well, if there's someone who's had multiple roles, many different roles, was a human resources expert and then was the comptroller of the company and then ended up being the head of information technology, that person's a generalist because they did a lot of different things. And so what I do is I simply count the number of roles, and if my theory is right, that suggests that those people who have done many roles in the past are the ones who are most likely to start a business on their next job event. So this is just the raw data. Essentially, this is just a table of means, but whenever you look at something like this and you see these numbers that are so extreme, you know it's going to work no matter what you do. So let me show you the simple table. So what I did was I simply classified job events, and I said, all right, how many different roles have you had before this particular job event? And if you've had fewer than 3 roles, then your probability of starting a business on your next job event is about 3%, 0.03. Whereas if you've had more than 16 roles, and there were actually many people in the sample who had more than 16 roles, then your probability of starting a business on your next job event is order of magnitude greater, basically 30%, which you see by 0.29. Huge difference, huge difference. So what that tells you, again, is that essentially no matter what you hold constant, no matter what kind of statistical analysis you do, this theory is going to work, okay? Whenever you see something like that, you know this is going to work. Those are the only kinds of papers I write because I don't have the econometric skills that David or Tom have, and so I got to do simple stuff, and so I rely on getting lucky and finding good, simple relationships, and I've gotten lucky a couple times, and this was one of them. So here's a slightly more sophisticated version of the same thing. Here what I do is I hold constant, ignore everything but column 1. This is just different error structures. But just if you look at column 1, what you have here is whether the current employment event was one where you founded a business, so it's 1 if yes, 0 if not. And what I take into account here is your prior experience, that's EXP. The key variable here is N prior. N prior is the number of prior roles that you've had. That was what I showed you in the last table. And as you can see, that's a strongly significant factor in determining whether you're going to start a business. As you'll see, male is important here. I know we've actually had a large number of gender sessions, many of which I've attended here. These data, I should tell you, come from an earlier period. So the period at which these data were collected were the late 90s, and so many of the people who were in that cohort might have graduated in the 80s, even 70s. So it's from a different time. I'm not so sure this would still be true, but unfortunately, we don't have updated data to test that. You have cohort and those sorts of things in there. But again, the thing I want to emphasize is that these people, the people who do start businesses, are jacks of all trade. And that's essentially what this table tells you and what the simple table tells you. As I said, there are many analyses in that same paper that bolster that kind of finding. All right, so that's the old paper. So let me move on to the new paper. And that is, all right, given that these individuals are people who have many skills, some of that could be endowed, but some of it are skills that you actually go out and acquire strategically. And the question is, how do you do that? Well, I can tell you how you do it when you're at Stanford, because I see those guys. And what they do is I have someone come in and say she was an undergraduate in engineering, and there are those, who come from Stanford, and we have a very good engineering undergraduate program, and then they come to the MBA program and they say, I don't want to be a nerd anymore. I actually want to go out and have the kinds of skills that will allow me to move up the hierarchy in the firm and not be simply pigeonholed into some staff position, which is what happens, of course, if you're an engineer. You can make a lot of money, but again, you're going to tend to do one thing and do that for the rest of your life. And so what these people do is they take a general curriculum. They'll take organizational behavior, they'll take marketing, they'll take human resources, personnel economics, and that's to round out their background. So what I want to do then is I want to talk about this again at a more macro level, and as I mentioned, this is going to be the paper that's forthcoming. And the basic idea in this analysis is the following: that in order to start a business, you have to have two kinds of skills. One of them is what we call the advantages of youth. And the reason we leave it as the advantages of youth is we can't really observe those advantages, but we just say, well, those are whatever it is, it's correlated with being young. And you can think of those sorts of things. It could be creativity. Young people tend to be more creative than older people. Lots of new ideas, some crazy, but, some good. Lots of energy. Those are young people tend to be more energetic than older people, although Bob and I pride ourselves at being at the upper tail of the low energy distribution. Christian. Well, I guess Christian. Yeah, I think a Christian is a young man, but anyway. But still, you think of energy, you might think of risk preference, and you might even think of the time horizon because you have many more years if you can't use the capital markets to do that. So we're not going to be specific about that. What we're going to do is just assume that there are some advantages to being young that are helpful in starting a business and in creating ideas for that. But the one thing that is true is that although young people are creative and energetic and have lots of ideas, they don't know anything. And that's kind of a problem because it's helpful to know something if you want to start a business. So one way that you learn something is that you work for someone else who's been successful at starting a business. And people do that. In fact, in the Stanford data, that was one of the things that was most common, is you don't start the business right out of the MBA program. What you tend to do is you work for a few years for someone else, get some skills, and then start the business. But, and this is the key point of the paper that I'm going to tell you about, your ability to get skills that will be helpful in having you start your own business depends on the job that you have in someone else's firm. So if you have a very low-level job in that firm, you're not going to have the opportunity to learn things about starting a business. You're not going to get the experiences. You're not going to have the kinds of interactions. You won't be able to network as well. And all of those things are going to be a disadvantage. Whereas if you're at the top of the firm, you get those experiences, and you could get those as a very young person. So what I'm going to tell you about is my co-author, who is, in some sense, the motivation for this paper. As I said, I always look at the real world, and this guy was close to me. He was my PhD student at Stanford, and he's a brilliant guy. And how many people from China in here? Okay. So how many people have heard of a company called C-Trip? Okay, well, everybody, they're smiling because they know who I'm talking about, because this guy's a very famous guy in China. His name is James Liang, or Xinjian Yang in Chinese, something like Xinjian. I can't ever say his name appropriately, Xinjiang or something, but I'll let you guys say it. But you know who I'm talking about. And James has a very interesting background. Now, as I said, he's a very talented guy, really a very talented guy. He's done many, many interesting things. But the part that's relevant for what I want to talk about today is his experience in Silicon Valley. So James went to Fudan University when he was 14 years old, and then came to the United States and did his undergraduate degree in computer science, and then moved to Silicon Valley and worked for a company called Oracle, which is a very large company, as you know. And it was a growing company and not small at the time that he worked for it, but by the time he was 28 years old, he was the vice president in charge of all of consulting for Oracle. And that was common. That's not unusual in Silicon Valley. I mentioned Mark Zuckerberg earlier. We've got lots and lots of people who are under 30 who are in the top echelons of firms. Why is that? Well, because that's a new business with new technology where the older people simply don't have the knowledge necessary to work in that industry, so the industry is dominated by young people. That's a good thing if you want to get the kinds of skills necessary to start your own business, because what it does is it means you get to be the big guy in the firm, and that's what James did. And after a couple of years at Oracle, he quit, went back to China, and started C-Trip. And then, of course, sure enough, what he found was the same thing that he did to Oracle, his employees did to him. Namely, they quit, went out and started their own businesses from the experiences that they got there. So that's the motivation behind this analysis and the story that we're going to tell. And we're going to use that idea to examine entrepreneurship rates in countries throughout the world. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to argue that that it turns out, when I say it turns out, I will show you the data, that the single most important factor in determining the entrepreneurship rate in any country is the age structure of that country. Is it an old country or a young country? That's true in the cross-section, and it's also true over time within a country. And as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to motivate this by talking about a couple of Asian countries, namely Japan and China. China I'm going to put off until the end when we talk a little bit about policy and talk about the one-child policy, because that obviously has implications for the demographic structure. But let me talk about Japan for a moment. Japan, as everybody knows, is a rapidly aging country, a country that's gotten quite old over time. But at one time, Japan was a young country, and it had very high rates of entrepreneurship. And in fact, we in the United States were always worried that Japan was going to take over the world, because business formation and just the rate of growth and the activity that was going on in Japan was so high, and then all of a sudden it slowed down. And you can say, well, this might have had to do with the Asian financial crisis, but other countries went through the Asian financial crisis, and Japan has had 20 years of low growth rates, and the question is why. And what we argue is much of that is a result of low business formation, low rates of entrepreneurship associated with the aging population. Now, when I tell you that there's an aging population, I know what you're thinking, because I thought this too. I thought, well, that's kind of obvious. Young people are the ones who start businesses. Old people don't start businesses. Turns out that's a relatively minor factor. It's not the composition. It's not the age composition of the country. It's actually the age structure of the country. And it goes back to the Silicon Valley story. And the way I'm going to make that point is to show you that not only is it true that young countries have higher rates of entrepreneurship and higher rates of business formation, but it's true at every age. So, for example, and who's from Korea in here? How many people from Korea? I know someone. I know one, at least. Okay, so a few of you from Korea. Well, Korea is also an aging country, but Korea is still a much younger country than is Japan, and it's only recently started to age and age quite rapidly. So if you look at Korea as compared to Japan, what you will see is that entrepreneurship rates in Korea are significantly higher than entrepreneurship rates in Japan, and that's true at every age. And what I mean by that is if I look at 30-year-olds in Japan and I compare them to 30-year-olds in Korea, the Korean 30-year-olds are more entrepreneurial than the 30-year-old Japanese. So at any age, and that's true at 50 years old, and that's true at 40 years old, and it's even true at my age. Okay, well, I'm so old I'm not in the data set, but it's true actually. There's a reason for that, and the reason for that we push is, again, the story that I told you about James, which is if you have an old society like Japan, it's pretty tough to become a high-level manager until you're in your 50s, and by then it's essentially too late to start a business. And so that's going to be the argument that we're going to make, and I'm going to show you that more formally and a little bit more, hopefully more convincingly than just the story. So again, the young people have advantages, creativity, energy. The older people in this particular society may end up blocking the opportunities for the young people to get the skills necessary to form businesses. And so I'm going to show you that that's actually true in the real data. All right. So let me just take 2 minutes to do a little bit of formal modeling here. It's pretty simple modeling. The model actually consists of only two things. There's a demographic model, and then there's a very simplified economic model. So let me walk you through the demographic model first. So the demographic model says what we want to do is we want to model the world's demographic structure, okay, the entire world's demographic structure, and we want to do that with one parameter. So the one parameter is R. And what R is you want to think of that as the shrinkage rate of the population. So what R means is that when R is high, you've got an aging population. The population is shrinking because the young cohort is smaller than the old cohort. And when R is negative, that means you have a growing population because a negative shrinkage rate is the same as a growth rate. And so what we're going to do is we're going to model the whole age distribution simply by saying that the proportion of people, look at the second equation, the cumulative, the proportion of people at age A who are below age A in a country that has a shrinkage rate R is simply given by this simple exponential form, okay? And that's made up, we're just going to assume that. But it turns out it's perfect, okay? It's absolutely perfect. So, David was bragging about an R. What was your R squared, David? 0.93, something like that? That's peanuts. I mean, this one is 0.998. So I told you I was going to one-up you today, all right? It basically fits it perfectly. Now, of course, any model would give you a pretty high R squared because you're fitting a cumulative on age, and you know that at one point it's going to be 1, and at the other point it's going to be 0. So you want to think of the base, even if you didn't have any explanatory variables at all, as having an R squared of maybe 0.85 or 0.9. So all R is giving you is the increase from there. But essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to use this to capture the fact that this simple structure is essentially perfect for our purposes. It captures virtually everything we need to do. All right, and there's simply a picture of that, but I think I don't have to walk you through that. And then the second part is the economic model. And the economic model is kind of like the model of occupational choice that I showed you about 10 minutes ago, but it's a little bit different in terms of the way we structure it. It's essentially the same thing. The question is, do you want to be an entrepreneur or do you want to work for someone else? And that depends on the value of your entrepreneurial idea and your ability to implement that idea, and that's given by this V, the first equation there. And that depends on two things. It depends on the human capital that you have, H, and it depends on your advantages of youth, Q, and we'll call that, you can think of that as creativity, energy, put in whatever word you want. That's what's in Q. So the higher the amount of human capital you have and the higher amount of creativity you have, the more likely you are to start a business. And if you substitute everything in, you end up with the last two equations, which is that the entrepreneurship rate at age A in a country that has shrinkage parameter R is simply given by this equation here. Or, if you like, you can do that in terms of the entrepreneurship rate at age A, given that S of A of the population is less than U. So there is less than S of A in the population. In other words, if you're age 30 and you're in a young country, then at age 30 you're an old man, which means that you're at the top of the hierarchy. 80% of the population is below you, so SA would be 0.8 in that case. All right? So that's essentially what we're going to do, and we're going to model that. And then with that, we derive seven propositions, and I'm going to summarize those for you right here. We don't have time to go through all the math, and it's kind of boring, but you have to do that if you want to publish in the JPE, so I did it. Anyway, so what you get are the following implications. The first one is the one that I motivated this with. Older countries, as measured either by the shrinkage parameter or the median age, they're going to be the same. They're correlated perfectly. Those older countries are going to have lower average entrepreneurship rates. So if you look at Japan, again, I don't mean to pick on the Japanese. Where's Hideo? Hideo, raise your hand. Where are you here? Okay, so another one of my very creative and talented PhD students is sitting in the back of the room, but he didn't start a travel agency in Japan. He's an academic like me, so he's poor. But if you look at Japan, for example, and you compare that to Uganda, Uganda is the youngest country in the world. It also has the highest rate of entrepreneurship in the world. Turns out those two just worked out, okay? So that happens to be true. But what's also true is that older countries have lower entrepreneurship rates at any given age. And again, that's the thing that's a little bit more surprising. It's not the composition that's driving it. It's actually the within age group differences that's driving almost all of the action. So let me show you that in a minute. And then what the theory predicts, and it's basically a result of that demographic structure, is that the relation of entrepreneurship to age is going to be an inverted U, and I want to come back to that to sort of bookend this conference, come back to Steve Machen's point. I told him that this was going to actually relate to some of his things, and maybe you see where I'm going to be going in a minute. And then finally, the entrepreneurship rates decline the most when a country ages for the middle-aged individuals. And again, that's also a function of that demographic structure that I assumed that comes right out of that thing. So, all right. The data that we're going to use is something called the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. And that is a survey of approximately 82 countries, 1.3 million individuals. It's not quite a panel in the sense that we don't have every year for every country. In fact, we don't have most years for every country. We have them for the big countries, US, Germany, UK. I'm not sure about Australia. But we have them for a lot of countries, so we can do some fixed effect, some country effect stuff within country. But most of it is going to be cross-sectional. And we check that with another data set called the Flash Eurobarometer Survey, completely different data set that just focuses on the OECD countries. Turns out, amazingly, the results were identical, and I mean identical. Like even the size of the coefficients were within, 1 or 2 percentage points of one another. So that was kind of, again, that's another piece of good luck. But it also suggests that there actually is something going on in the theory that actually works. Okay. So let me show you the results. This is, I'm going to show you a little bit more sophisticated version of this. But for right now, we can get 90% of what we need simply by looking at this picture. So what this picture shows you is the entrepreneurship rate and at every age. So ages go from 20 to 65 in the data set. That's how we set everything up. So we're talking about working age individuals. And what we did here is simply to split the whole data set into 3 different groups: old countries, middle-aged countries, and young countries. And so the one at the top is, those are the rates for the young countries. The one in the middle is the entrepreneurship rate for the middle-aged countries, and the one at the bottom are the entrepreneurship rates for the old countries. And what you see is a couple of things. First, you see that they don't cross. The fact that they don't cross tells you that at any given age, it's always going to be the case that the old countries have lower rates of entrepreneurship than the younger countries do. The other thing you notice is that those curves are an inverted U shape. Now, why did I say this relates to Steve's stuff? Well, remember when Steve motivated his analysis, one of the things that he talked about was the inverted U-shaped relationship between age and crime. So young kids aren't too good at criminal activity, but then they learn how to do it pretty well. They get some skills, and then what happens is they commit crime, but then they kind of burn out, and then, crime rates go back down. Well, that's essentially what's going on here, and it really is the same model in many respects, because the idea that Steve had in his model was that if you took people out of their ability to do criminal activity at the point when they were young, what you would do is you would have a permanent effect on that. Why? Because you were affecting their stock of human capital. The same idea is going on here. It's the same motivation. So as I said, when I saw Steve's stuff, I thought, hey, that's pretty cool. We got this. It's basically the same paper. You just kind of change the labels and you got it nailed. So anyway, all right, so that's it. And then the other thing that you'll see is that the inverted U is most pronounced for the youngest countries. That is, when you age, you affect the people in the middle-age groups the most, more than you do at the other end. And again, that's a result. That's not quite so obvious, but that's a result that comes directly from the demographic structure that is assumed. Okay, so let me show you a couple more pictures, and then I'll show you some slightly more formal analyses, and then we'll move on to the last topic. All right, so this is simply a scatter of countries that gives you the median age or the shrinkage parameter. As I said, they're the same. You can do it one or the other, and so I put them both up. And what you see is the relation of age to entrepreneurship, and as is pretty obvious from this graph, it's a negatively sloped line. So if you drew a line through there, you're going to get a negative slope. Now, one thing you might say is, well, wait a minute, do we really want to compare Uganda with Germany? And I know, Christian probably would say, I'd be happy to live in Uganda right now. I know he's stuck in London, but maybe we can find you a visa or something down there, and you can start a business because they're very entrepreneurial. That's the one thing that you see. But it's also true that even if you do this within the OECD countries, the same relationship holds. It's a little harder to see, of course, but you get the same basic idea. So let me show you a slightly more formal analysis. So what we do here is this is simply a country-level regression. So I'm not looking at anything within age group here. We're just simply taking the country as the unit of analysis, compute its shrinkage rate, compute its R, which is easy to do. You just fit that. And then take that R and then tell me, well, how does that predict entrepreneurship rates? And what you see in columns 1 and 2, 1 is for all countries, 2 is simply for the OECD countries, is that R is a very good and negative predictor of the entrepreneurship rate, as I argued. And the same is true in the next 2 columns, where instead of using R, we just use median age. So this is simply a regression version of the scatter plot that I showed you earlier. Now, what you might argue is, well, maybe that's picking up other factors. And of course, many people argue that, especially referees who are, it's like, isn't it awful that we have to deal with referees in the world? I mean, geez. But anyway, we did, so I had to put all this stuff in. And if you put those things in and you say, well, what kinds of things might be correlated with this? One of the things you might think about is growth rates or GDP per capita. You might want to hold those kinds of things constant. Share in agriculture, might want to hold that constant. All of those things reflect stages of development and so forth, which makes a lot of sense, I think. It turns out, and again, as I say, it turns out because you can look at the results yourself, those things are not very good predictors of what's going on in terms of an entrepreneurship rate. In fact, even the most obvious ones, like the cost of starting a business or property rights, standard stuff that we usually associate with entrepreneurship, they're just blown away by these demographic factors. The demographic factors are just way more important than anything else. They just drive everything else out of business. There's one exception, and this came up actually in a seminar. So I go to Switzerland a lot, and I gave this talk in Israel once as well. And what Switzerland has in common with Israel is they both have a military draft. You got to serve in the armed forces in both of those countries. And I don't remember whether this was suggested in Switzerland. Maybe you remember, Johannes, but it might have been in Switzerland at one of our seminars. But someone said, I'll bet if you look at countries that have military service, they're going to be more entrepreneurial. And the logic was that when you're thinking about the kinds of skills that you get, like in Silicon Valley when you're working for Oracle and you're the vice president, you get that same stuff in the military. The military is a very young organization. You have a 25-year-old who's in charge of 5,000 people and making life and death decisions. So you get experience in the military that is akin to the kinds of experience that you would get at the top level of a firm. And in fact, that shows up very strongly. So we put that in there. So again, kind of makes sense and is pretty consistent, at least with the logic of the model. So I thought whoever suggested it, I owe them a beer. Anyway, all right. So this is the country level regression. If you look at the within country stuff, so when I say within country, what we can do is in any given country, you have entrepreneurship rates for every given age group. And that's what this one does. This essentially fits those pictures that I showed you a couple of minutes ago when I referred to Steve's work. So those inverted U-shaped diagrams are fitted by this particular structure. And we've also estimated this. There's a table in the paper, if you look at it, where we estimate it individually for every single age group. And for every single age group, what you find is that as you do the cross-section, those countries that are older have lower rates of entrepreneurship within every single age group in the data set. So in other words, between 20 and 65 years old, every single one of them works. And you can do a decomposition, essentially an analysis of variance, and ask how much of the variance in entrepreneurship rates across countries is a result of what you might think of as a composition effect, lots of young people, meaning those people are going to start businesses, and how much of it is a result of the fact that it's a young country that makes the within age group variation different. And it turns out, as I said in the data, if you look at this, it's the second factor, not the first, which was quite surprising to me. It's the cross-sectional variation, which again is consistent with the theory. All right. There are a number of corroborating findings here. I went to a paper this morning by my colleague Catherine Shaw talking about some of her work with Andrew Sorensen. And one of the things that they find is that if you look at second ventures, so serial entrepreneurship, second ventures are more successful than first ventures. Not surprising, but again, that's kind of a human capital idea. It's that you acquire skills, you may fail in your first business, but you learn something in doing that, and then that helps you become an entrepreneur in the second business, and there's a good bit of evidence on that, not just from their work, but from some others as well. All right. Problem with this analysis is, I mean, I think it's cool, but it's not proof. And the reason it's not proof is it's at a very macroeconomic level. It's at an aggregated level where we're looking at the average rates. Even within a country, you're still looking at the average rates for a given age group. It's pretty aggregated kind of data. And it would be nice to know if it is supported by micro-level data. And of course, I'm primarily a microeconomist, so that's the kind of thing I would certainly think about doing. So the first thing we did is we wheeled out the old Stanford data, and we said, you know, can you explain entrepreneurship by past experience at being at a high level in someone else's firm? And in fact, no question, that's true. So if I was a vice president at Oracle, I've got a much higher chance of starting a business in my next event than if I was a low-level person at Oracle. Problem is, that's not so convincing, as we all know, because it's a selection effect. Could be a very strong selection effect. So what you want to do is you want to look at something that's a bit more exogenous. And so that's what we're doing in the current paper. And of course, so David and I last night were having an argument about is Sweden better than Denmark? So we use the Danish. I know the Danish data, and I got a bunch of Danish buddies. He's got a bunch of Swedish buddies. So I use the Danish stuff. Anyway, the Danish administrative data is very good for this purpose, because what it allows us to do is look at the entire structure of a firm and see how that structure of a firm affects the individuals in that firm. And that's essentially what we're trying to do. It's the Oracle story. Oracle was a very young firm, so lots of people in that firm are getting the kinds of skills necessary to start a business in their subsequent lives. All right, so that's what we do. I'm going to skip the model here. But essentially what the model tells you is that if you're in a firm where, for some reason, the managerial slots get filled by young people, you're more likely to start a business later on. And so what would happen? Well, let's say you happen to be in a firm where a bunch of the old guys, the firm is kind of top-heavy, and you got a lot of retirements as a result in one particular cohort. You're lucky, because now they need to promote people into the managerial positions. And so what this predicts is that if you're in a firm where there's lots of retirement, you should be more likely to start a business later on. So kind of an exogenous sort of factor over which you personally have no control. That's not really selection. That seems like it's something associated more with the firm than with the individual. Similarly, if you're in a new industry, if you happen to be working in a new industry, lots of people in that industry, there's higher separation rates, and as a result, lots of mobility, so you move up faster within that industry. So again, same kind of idea, rapidly growing industries related kind of idea. All right, so that's what we're trying to do, is find something that's exogenous. And as I said, this is in its embryonic stages. Unfortunately, it's in its embryonic stages for a long time, which, as I said, may suggest that it will never be born. But we're still hoping. So let me show you at least a couple of the things that do work. So the first table, the first set of regressions there, is essentially just looking at your probability of starting a business conditional on whether you were a young manager in the firm. And as you see, it's very strongly positive, significant, but again, that's not so convincing, because that's like the Stanford data. That could simply be selection. Those people who get promoted into high-level positions may also be those same people who have entrepreneurial skills. So you want to look at something else. So what we do in the second one is we say, well, let's not look at the individual, but instead let's look at the proportion of the firm that has young bosses as opposed to old bosses. And that's a little bit more exogenous to the individual. And then we say, well, if you happen to find yourself in a firm that has lots of young bosses, again, kind of like, the old guys retired, so lots of open slots. That's what you're all hoping at universities, that all of us, Bob and I'm going to include you now too, Christian, that we'll all retire and it'll open up slots for you guys, and as a result, you'll get tenure even if you don't deserve it, right? So that's kind of what you... So that's the hope, but again, that's what we're trying to test here, and it turns out that works pretty well. So when I say pretty well, here's a picture of it. If you look at what is the likelihood of starting a business in Denmark, on average, it's hard to read here, but it looks like it's about, 3.5%, something like that. That's the likelihood that you'll found a business on your next job event. But if you happen to work in a firm where 10% of the managers were young bosses, then it's about 4.5%. And if you happen to be in a firm where only 5% are young bosses, then it's about less than 3%. So again, it goes in the right direction. It's a pretty strong effect. So again, I would say, at least at this stage, that's the strongest evidence that we have at the micro level that this thing works. Couple of other things. Again, there's been a lot of discussion about gender at this conference, and I mentioned that earlier in the Stanford data. One of the things that's true in Scandinavia, and it's true throughout the world, of course, but one of the things that's been true in Scandinavia is over time, women have been more successful at getting into managerial positions. Some of it is pressure from the government. Some of it is simply firms deciding it's a good idea to do it. But what that does, of course, is if women take up managerial slots, it means that there are fewer managerial slots available for men. So what the model predicts, what the story predicts, is that the more women you have in management, the less likely it will be that males in that same firm should go on to start a business. And that works. That's true. The women, by the way, are also more likely to start a business, because women now get the same skills that the men were getting before. Now, as a result of having managerial experience, they then have the skills to go out and start a business later on, and that works as well. The reason I'm a little cautious about telling you this stuff is the effects are strong, actually too strong. And we're sort of worried that we're picking up something else. I mean, we have industry controls in there and all kinds of stuff. But to my taste, it looks like there's sort of too much going on here. So I mention it to you because I think it's an intriguing result, but don't spread it too widely, at least not yet. All right. Let me do one extension, and then I'm going to stop. I told Bob I would be done within about 40 minutes. I'm just right about on it. So let me give you one that is kind of a fun way to end. I want to go back to the jack of all trades idea and argue that entrepreneurship and leadership are very closely related. Now, what do I mean by leadership? Well, who's a leader? Think of a leader as a high-level person in an organization, someone like a COO, a CIO, a managing director, someone on the board. Those people are leaders in some sense. And so what we did was we looked at the Stanford data and said, all right, let's see whether individuals who have C-level positions get there with the same kinds of characteristics that were important in creating entrepreneurs. So I don't know if you remember the entrepreneurship regression, the jack of all trades model. I showed you a bunch of stuff, different prior roles and so forth. And the idea would be that same model, that same kind of idea should explain leadership as well, getting promoted into a entrepreneurial position. Unfortunately, these numbers are a little small, but the first row is that N prior, that same variable. And what you'll see is that the more roles you've had, the higher the likelihood that you will be in a C-level position. Now, that doesn't mean you'll be rich, okay? What it means is that you'll be more likely to become a C-level person, but not necessarily a rich person. In fact, the coefficient in the second column, which is on the log of income as opposed to your probability of becoming a leader, is actually negative here. All right, now, the reason I wanted to end on this is one of the nice things that we had in the Stanford data set, and this took some work. I actually had to convince the Stanford administration to allow me to look at transcripts. So I could look at the courses that individuals took. I can even look at the grades that they got. And what I found was that people who took economics were the ones most likely to become C-level individuals in the firm. Now, that didn't mean they were rich, so if you look at the second column, what you'll see is that the coefficient on economics in income is essentially 0. And so the question is, why is it that economics teaches you to become a leader? And so this is conjecture, but I always think it's nice to end a talk on conjecture. So let me throw out this idea. If you think about what economics teaches you that you can use in the real world, the answer is nothing. Okay? I mean, basically nothing. I mean, we don't have any skills that we can, unless you become a consultant to, like, do litigation consulting and become an expert witness. Basically, economics is useless. Once in a while, Bob mentioned, if you get to be president's chief economic advisor, you can kind of sell that stuff. But depends on who the president is, actually. At least in my case, I was able to sell it. But most of the time, it doesn't have much value. But what economics teaches you to do is it teaches you to think about very difficult, ugly problems and to think of it in a parsimonious way and to structure a model where you'd say, I'm going to write down just a few things, the simplest stuff, but what I think of as the most essential stuff, and I can grind out a solution to that. And if you're the CEO, that's essentially what you have to do. You basically take this fuzzy mess of data, real-world problems, and you say, I got to come up with an answer. And how do I do that? Well, economics teaches you to think logically and think analytically and think in a hard-nosed way about that. And so that's my conjecture. Obviously, I have no proof for that, but it's certainly consistent with the findings here. So let me conclude. I started out by arguing that entrepreneurship is essentially a personnel economics kind of analysis because what we're really doing is looking at occupational choice. I argued that general skills are important. The opportunity to acquire those skills depends on the structure of the society, in particular on the age structure of the society, and concluded by saying, well, if you're interested in leadership, that may be a way to think about it as well. So let me stop there, almost right on time. Brilliant. Okay.
For a talkative person, I don't quite know what to say. I mean, that was just extraordinary. But I tell you what sort of did go through my mind. I took David card to Treasury, and the Treasury official said to David, why did you work on youth and drugs? And you know how David has this sort of silly little giggle. He has this silly little giggle and he says, oh, you work on what you know. And I'm sitting there listening to Eddie, and I'm thinking about my great introduction, and I'm saying, well, what does Eddie know? And what is he talks about himself, right? You think about what he's talking about. He's talking about exceptional people who have skills everywhere, right? And so on. He just left out one thing, which I thought would be a little bit rude, because I was getting sick of saying how brilliant Eddie was in every dimension. But one of the students said to me, I want to make money. And I said, like Eddie said, I don't know whether you picked this up, I'm only a poor academic. Did you hear him say that? And then all of a sudden he says, oh, I was talking to Mark Zuckerberg yesterday, who lives in my neighborhood. I don't know whether you know who Mark Zuckerberg is, but he must have money as well. So I'm getting very, very depressed at this point, but I've got one thing that I might, we're very competitive, right? I've got one thing I might possibly win at. I do give good talks, right? And that's what I think. And I'm listening to Eddie and my spirits are going down and down and down. I don't know. I just thought that was absolutely brilliant. Eddie, thank you very much. Now, one of the reasons, I'm not going to have any questions because people have got planes to catch and things, so I thought, Eddie's still here, right? He's staying until tomorrow, so we can pick him up afterwards. I want Christian to come up and talk a little bit about the future, where we're going. Everybody here is a member of the society, and I think it's a good idea to find out from Christian what's going to happen or what we're trying to plan to do in the future. Christian? That was just really good.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a great talk, and Bob has my admiration as well, because you may not have realized, but we had 6 keynotes at this conference. One by Steve Machin, one by Eddie Lazear, one by David Card, and 3 by Bob Gregory. Okay, so what we are doing now is actually what we usually call an assembly meeting. And I would like to talk a little bit about the vision for this society. This is not just a great conference, but it's supposed to be the inaugural conference of a society which so far has not been established yet. So we are working on establishing the society. The society has an assembly, and this is the assembly meeting. So you can think about the assembly as the citizens of a country. Those citizens are voting a government. The government is the executive board. So at this moment, we have an executive board, but we have dictatorially determined it because we haven't got really society yet. The people on the executive board are, of course, Bob Gregory, Dean Hislop, Daiji Kawaguchi, Jungmin Lee, Ming Yen Lin, Yunzen Zhang, Steve Machin, Xin Meng, Jessica Pan, Abigail Payne, and Dandan Zhang, and Yang Yao from Beijing University. So this executive board at this moment is trying to establish the society. So the next step in that will be to decide on the constitution. We had a meeting where we kind of drafted a constitution which now has to be put into paper. But then the most important thing is to legalize this society. So we need a legal form for this society, and we need a legal home for this society. We decided that the legal home should be in Asia, because it's foremost, of course, an Asian, but then also Australasian society. We are thinking about a number of countries where we can do that, and we are looking into that right now. So that could be Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, or maybe Korea, and you will learn about that when we have made some progress. Now, we will inform the people who are basically the assembly of a society which doesn't really exist yet. So what makes you the assembly is that you paid a fee to attend this conference. And that will be the model in the future. So the members, the assembly of the society will be everybody who will pay a membership fee. Membership fees come together with basically paying the fee for the next conference. So by the next conference year, we hope we have a legal constitution, we have a legal home for the society, and we can go on to determine the different functionaries of the society. So that will be a president, that will be a treasury, and that a treasurer, and that will be a secretary. The secretary and the treasurer, we decided, will be nominated and voted for by the executive committee, while the president and the members of the executive committee will be voted in by the assembly, and that is basically everybody who has paid up to be part of this society. The question is, what is about the terms of all those individuals? And we decided to follow, well, to some extent, the model we have in Europe. The people on the executive committee will be voted for 3 years with one possibility of renewing the term. That would be 6 years. The treasurer and the secretary will likewise be voted in for 3 years, and the president for 2 years. So that's the model which is half between Sole and half between Eale. The solar model is good because many people can call themselves president. On the other hand, the problem with the solar model is you do the conference organization once, you may discover many problems with that, and the next time you just simply pass the buck to the next president who will have to deal with the same problems again. So a 2-year term seemed to us a very good compromise. Now, where will be the next conference? Very likely, so we haven't completely confirmed that, but very likely next year we will go to Hong Kong. We will inform you, we have your email addresses about that. We will announce the next conference in a very similar way. It will be a very similar time schedule. It will be, well, by email and via all the different distributors. And you should watch out for that. And we very much hope that this is the start. It was an unbelievably successful conference, we believe. Particularly, the weather has been fantastic, but everything else has been absolutely great, and we hope we will continue this very successfully. Now, at the end, I would like to, Bob, I'm sorry, that's the problem with Bob. If he can't talk for 5 minutes, extremely edgy and nervous. Sorry, Bob. Yes, okay. Okay, Bob gets very nervous, but I'm at the last part, Bob, and then you can take over. Okay, so, well, we actually should thank, I thanked initially all the people who have been involved. But there are basically, say, 3 teams which were absolutely essential. First, of course, the team here at ANU. Rabi, who was extremely supportive in providing us with the financial means to do this. Meng, John Tang, and then, of course, Bob. The admin team at UCL Cream, which had done an unbelievable job in working behind the curtains, setting up the program, etc., and worked around the clock over the last days. And then, of course, the team here at ANU, and a representative for the team is Lily and the many other administrators who have worked very hard for this conference. Now, where are the flowers, Bob?
That's what I wanted to tell you.
Oh, here we go.
This idea of having many skills and being an all-rounder and listening to Ed, not everybody falls into that category. So Lily Serick, who ran this conference, I thought, from my perspective, from the camp, it was absolutely brilliant. She's been here every day. So what should we do? We should do the obvious thing, give her flowers and wine. And you know what? She doesn't want to receive it publicly. So she wouldn't come. So she's outside somewhere. But I don't see why I should let her push me around, right? So if you bump into her, embarrass her and tell her how great it was. And that's what I wanted to tell you. So let's all thank the administrators who really do all the hard work here. Thank you very much.
And of course, Bob had the last word.